companies, foundations, and universities. About 80,000 people work for the network. The network's efforts range from small, the microloans and financing that are so important to eager but resource-poor entrepreneurs, to 2 entire universities. The 5 campuses of the Aga Khan University and the University of Central Asia, whose School of Professional and Continuing Education has served nearly 50,000 students in Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan. His Highness once made the following remark: "Education has been important to my family for a long time. My forefathers founded Al-Azhar University in Cairo some 1,000 years ago. Discovery of knowledge was seen by these founders as an embodiment of religious faith. Faith is reinforced by knowledge of workings of the Creator's physical world. The form of universities has changed over these 1,000 years, but that reciprocity between faith and knowledge remains a source of strength." Whether for 250 years or 1,000, we at Brown recognize and celebrate the institutions and people throughout the world who champion fundamental values like the discovery of knowledge and the notion that knowledge is a globally shared source of strength. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming His Highness the Aga Khan.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. President Paxson, Ogden family representatives, Brown University faculty, students and alumni, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Madam President, for your very kind introduction. It is a great honor for me to give the Ogden Lecture, to be included in the distinguished company of past Ogden lecturers, and to pay tribute to the memory of Stephen Ogden. I am also delighted to be present for the opening weekend of Brown's 250th anniversary, or one might say, the happy conclusion of Brown's first quarter of a millennium. I have long felt a close sense of belonging at Brown. My eldest son, who is looking at me with intensity, was a member of the Brown class of 1995. And I treasure the fact that I received an honorary degree from Brown and was privileged at that time to give the baccalaureate address. My own education has blended Islamic and Western traditions. I was studying at Harvard some 56 years ago when I inherited the Ismaili Imamate. It's not a political role, as has been mentioned. But let me emphasize that Islamic belief sees the spiritual and material worlds as inextricably connected. Faith should deepen our concern for improving the quality of human life in all its dimensions. That is the overarching objective of the Aga Khan Development Network, which President Paxson has described so well. It has been said that giving an effective university lecture requires the boldness to make some strong predictions about the future. I might suggest that President Paxson has put me in a slightly embarrassing position today by inviting me to return to speak on the Brown campus. The challenge with coming back to give a second lecture is that you have to explain what you got wrong the first time. As I look back over some 18 years now to 1996, I think I actually underestimated how many things would change in the years ahead. If you were a student at Brown 18 years ago, you would not have had any Facebook friends. And you wouldn't be following anyone on Twitter. And even more sadly, perhaps, no one would be following you. There was no instant messaging at that time. Indeed, as I recall, people actually used their telephone primarily for talking. In fact, email itself was still quite a new thing in 1996, and those are only the most obvious examples of transformative change in our world. So, what has been the impact of such changes? We often think about technological innovation as a great source of hope for the world. We hear about how the Internet can reach out across boundaries, helping us all to stay in touch, and giving us access to information from every imaginable source. But it is worth remembering that the same affirmations have greeted new communication technologies for centuries. From the printing press to the telegraph, to television and radio. Yet in each case, while many hopes were fulfilled, many were also disappointed. In the final analysis, the key to human cooperation and concord is not dependent on advances in the technologies of communication, but rather on how human beings go about using or abusing their technological tools. Among the risks of our new communications world is its potential contribution to what I would call the growing centrifugal forces in our time, the forces of fragmentation. These forces, I believe, can threaten the coherence of democratic societies and the effectiveness of democratic institutions. Yes, the information revolution for individuals and for communities can be a great liberating influence, but it also carries some important risks. More information at our fingertips can mean more knowledge and understanding, but it can also mean more fleeting attention spans, more impulsive judgments, and more dependence on superficial snapshots of events. Communicating more often and more easily can bring people closer together, but it can also tempt us to live more of our lives inside smaller information bubbles, in more intense but often more isolated groupings. We see more people everywhere these days, standing or sitting or walking alone, absorbed in their handheld screens. But I wonder whether in some larger sense they're really more in touch. Greater connectivity does not necessarily mean greater connection. Information travels more quickly in greater quantities these days, but the incalculable multiplication of information can also mean more error, more exaggeration, more misinformation, more disinformation, more propaganda. The world may be right there on our laptops, but the truth about the world may be further and further away. The problem of fragmentation in our world is not a problem of diversity. Diversity itself should be a source of enrichment. The problem comes when diverse elements spin off on their own, when the bonds that connect us across our diversities begin to weaken. Too often, our world grows more complex. The temptation for some is to shield themselves from complexity. We seek the comfort of our simplicities, our own specialities, and often, as has been said, we risk learning more and more about less and less. And the result is that significant knowledge gaps can develop and persist. That danger is that knowledge gaps so often run the risk of becoming empathy gaps. The struggle to remain empathetically open to the other in a diversifying world is a continuing struggle of central importance for all of us. And the danger of having knowledge gaps will grow into empathy gaps. That was the theme of my address in 1996. I discussed then what was becoming an enormous knowledge gap, nearly an ignorance gap, between the worlds of Islam and the non-Muslim world. Since that time, to be sure, there have been moments of encouraging progress on this front, including academic-centered efforts here at Brown with your wonderful digital Islamic humanities program. But in many ways, that knowledge gap has worsened. We have heard predictions for some years now about some inevitable clash of the industrialized West with the Muslim world. These multiplied, of course, in the wake of the 9/11 tragedies and other violent episodes. But most Muslims don't think that way. Only an extreme minority does. For most of us, there is singularly little in our theology that would clash with the other Abrahamic faiths, with Christianity and with Judaism. And there is much more in harmony. What has happened to the Islamic tradition that says our best friends will be from the other Abrahamic faiths, known as the people of the book, all of whose faith builds on monotheistic revelation? Of course, much of what the West has seen about the Muslim world in recent years has been through a media lens of instability and confrontation. What is highly abnormal in the Islamic world thus often gets mistaken for what is normal. But that is all the more reason for us to work from all directions to replace fearful ignorance with empathetic knowledge. Down through many centuries, great Muslim cultures were built on the principles of inclusiveness. Some of the best minds and creative spirits from every corner of the world, independent of ethnic or religious identities, were brought together as great Muslim centers of learning. My own ancestors, the Fatimids, founded one of the world's oldest universities, Al-Azhar in Cairo, over 1,000 years ago. In fields of learning from mathematics to astronomy, from philosophy to medicine, Muslim scholars sharpened the cutting edge of human knowledge. They were the equivalents of thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, Galileo and Newton, yet their names are scarcely known in the West today. How many would recognize the name of Al-Khwarizmi, the Persian mathematician who developed some 1,200 years ago the algorithm which is the foundation of the search engine technology? I wondered what would have happened if Al-Khwarizmi had patented or copyrighted his algorithm. And I tried to analyze what would be the consequences. Well, the first consequence is that copyright lawyers around the world would either be billionaires or bust. There were those who had broken the copyright would be billionaires and the others goodbye. Secondly, the programs probably would have been renamed. So if they had been renamed, either they would have Muslim names, or they would keep their names. If they had Muslim names, they would be in Arabic or Turkish or Persian or Urdu, and none of you would be able to pronounce those names. If the names were kept, then they would be printed in the developing world, and you know what it's like to print English in the developing world. So Twitter would have become Twit. Google would have become Giggle. And our good friend Bill Gates, well, that would be the end of Bill Gates. But I can't be serious all the time, and sometimes I like a good laugh. So I, on the other hand, must get back to serious matters because this is supposed to be a serious lecture. In the Muslim world itself, as is true outside of it, much of our history and culture and art has been obscured, and with it, the clear sense of Muslim diversity. Among other incomprehensions is the increasing conflict between Sunni and Shia Muslims. In places like Pakistan and Malaysia, Iraq and Syria, Lebanon and Bahrain, Yemen and Somalia and Afghanistan, the Shia-Sunni conflict is becoming an absolute disaster. But the harsh truth is that religious hostility and intolerance between as well as within religions is contributing to violent crises and political impasse all across the world. In the Central African Republic, in South Sudan, in Nigeria, in Myanmar, in the Philippines and in the Ukraine, and in many other places. Such hostilities, of course, represent the most sinister side of what I have described as the centrifugal, fragmenting patterns of our times. So then, how can we respond to such tendencies? The response I would emphasize today is a thoughtful, renewed commitment to the concept of pluralism and to the closely related potential of civil society. A pluralist commitment is rooted in the essential unity of the human race. Does the Holy Quran not say that mankind is descended from a single soul? In an increasingly cosmopolitan world, it is essential that we live by a cosmopolitan ethic, one that addresses the age-old need to balance the particular and the universal, to honor both human rights and social duties, to advance personal freedom and to accept human responsibility. It is in that spirit that we can nurture bonds of confidence across different peoples and unique individuals, welcoming the growing diversity of our world, even in matters of faith, as a gift of the divine. Difference in this context can become an opportunity, not a threat, a blessing rather than a burden. This brings us to the challenges of governance in our time. How do we organize our complex societies to achieve harmony and coherence and progress, even at this time of growing diversity? These have always been difficult questions, and they're not getting any easier. As you know, they were particularly difficult questions for the United States. Back in this university's earliest years, as 13 former colonies tried to write a new national constitution. George Washington, who had presided over the Constitutional Convention, came to this campus in 1790, after just 1 year as president, when Brown itself was only a quarter of a century old. He traveled to Providence to mark the recent adoption of the new U.S. Constitution by the state of Rhode Island, the last of the original 13 states to do so. His visit was to celebrate the completion of that constitution writing process. You may have known about this from reading the plaque that still hangs on the wall of University Hall, on the brown main green, where Washington strolled that day with the university's president. I'm told, incidentally, that Washington was greeted here with the roar of cannons and the ringing of bells and a spirit of great decorum. I don't know about the cannon and the bells, but I must testify, as a Count University guest, that the great decorum has not changed at all. Thank you. Washington's visit in Providence marked a moment of historic constitutional significance. And the questions we have raised today, balancing centrifugal, fragmenting realities on the one hand, with the imperatives of national bonding and governing on the other, were central concerns for Washington at that moment and throughout his career. After 8 years of coping with these issues as the first American president, he made them the major theme of his famous farewell address. He was worried principally, he said then, about what he called the spirit of faction and its ability to undermine a sense of democratic nationhood. He described faction as a spirit that kindles the animosity of one part against another, creating a fatal tendency to elevate a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community against the whole. It threatened, he said, a frightful despotism, one that could render alien to each other those who ought to be bound together. Such threats of bonding and thus to balance have long presented a central governance challenge here and elsewhere. And these issues are now being addressed with new intensity all across the world. Amazing as it may seem, fully 37 countries have been writing or rewriting their constitutions in the last 10 years, with another 12 countries recently embarking on this path. This means that nearly 25% of the member countries of the United Nations have been rethinking these central governance concerns. And nearly 49 of these countries have majority Muslim populations. Clearly, many Muslim societies are seeking new ways to organize themselves. And there can be no one-size-fits-all. The outcomes obviously are going to be many and varied. The process will challenge the creativity of the world's best political and legal thinkers. Especially in the developing world, such matters will increasingly be in the hands of younger, more educated men and women, provided the system allows them to come to the forefront. These governance issues are frankly today of global concern. And I believe that the great universities of the world, and Brown University in particular, can also play an especially creative role in responding to them. The challenge, as we have said, will be one of balancing values and interests, honoring the importance of religious and ethical traditions, for example, while also respecting the free will of individual human beings, accommodating both the role of central governments and regional demands, reconciling the urban and the rural, providing for democratic change and institutional continuity. Creating new governance frameworks is obviously not an easy task, but it can be accomplished. In Kenya, just 3.5 years ago, for example, a new constitution, ratified by 2/3 of the voters, redistributed power dramatically from the central level to 47 county governments. In Tunisia, just a few weeks ago, a new consensus constitution with 94% approval from the elected Constituency Assembly reaffirmed the Islamic identity of the Tunisian state while also protecting the human rights of religious and ethnic minorities. In these cases, and in other places such as Bangladesh, one of the fundamental constructive forces at work has been the strength of civil society. It is a topic that is worth serious attention. And I'm happy to say that it has been getting increasing attention, including the exemplary cutting-edge work here at Brown of the Watson Institute for International Studies. By civil society, I mean an array of institutions that operate on a private, voluntary basis, but are motivated by high public purposes. They include institutions devoted to culture, to science and to research, to commercial, labor, ethnic and religious concerns, as well as a variety of professional societies. They include institutions of the media and education. I think the conclusion is that the success of democratic societies will depend in the end on more than democratic governments. The scale and the quality of civil society will become a factor, I believe, of enormous importance. A quality civil society has three critical underpinnings: a commitment to pluralism, an open door to meritocracy, and a full embrace of what I described earlier as a cosmopolitan ethic. The voices of civil society will reflect and express the growing complexity of society.